He's a fantastic foreign policy correspondent over at Reuters. Check out all his work at Reuters.com. That is Idrees Ali. Idrees, Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Yeah, of course. Glad to be here.
So listen, we wanted to have you on. Obviously, I mentioned to you when you and I were exchanging some messages back and forth about talking about the situation overall in Afghanistan, not only a historical perspective, but also going into some other involvements in the region, the difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But at a high level right now, the 30,000 foot view as of this moment, can you explain to our audience how the Taliban were able to take over 12 cities in Afghanistan so fast and really leave the U.S. kind of scrambling to get people out? Explain to us the totality of the situation over these last 3 weeks. Is that just an oversimplification, or give us a little bit more context if you could?
Yeah, I mean, just for background's sake, basically, for the past 20 years, the United States and a bunch of allies have essentially been training the Afghan military, building up the Afghan government with the hopes that one day, they could leave and that, this country could develop, essentially in their own image. That was the hope. And over the, essentially 4 presidents, each one has tried to get out from Afghanistan, but hasn't been able to. And things were really set in motion by Trump, former President Donald Trump last year, when he signed a peace deal with the Taliban, which essentially set the deadline for the withdrawal on May 1st. Obviously, President Biden won the election, in 2020, and essentially agreed to the same terms, but just moved it forward to September. And he made the announcement in April, and we basically started hearing, look, yes, we're going to withdraw in September. That was the plan back then. But don't worry, because the Afghan government, may struggle, but we're pretty confident that they can hold off the Taliban forces. That we heard General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, say, just a couple of months ago that he believed that Al-Qaeda, for example, wouldn't be a threat for at least 2 years to the U.S. homeland. So basically, there was some expectation that the Taliban would make some gain a couple of cities here and there, but that the Afghan government would be pretty cohesive, not cohesive maybe, but coherent and, be able to stand up. What happened was basically now 10 days ago, almost to the day, actually exactly to the day, we started seeing the Taliban taking over provincial capitals. So, before this, they were able to take over district centers. There are about 400 district centers spread around Afghanistan, but they're usually not very densely populated, and they don't really have any strategic value. And we initially started seeing the Taliban take those over in large numbers, but no one was really panicked because, again, a district center could literally be one police checkpoint from, city A to city B with really no population. But then 10 days ago, something turned, and we started seeing the Taliban take over provincial capitals, which is really where people live, has high strategic value. And when that happened, it caused a lot of panic. And honestly, it kind of felt like, a pack of cards or a house of cards where one fell. And, within essentially 8 days, 7 days, the whole country had fallen to the Taliban. The question is, why did that happen? And when we talk to sources, there are a couple of different reasons. First reason is, morale. So in a lot of cases, the Afghan security forces, were trained, but the lower level officials and soldiers were never really paid on time, didn't have the proper ammunition, clothing, food, stuff like that. So there was really low morale. So as the Taliban swept through them, the question became, if you're a lower level official, would you risk your life for a government that's not paying you? And the answer very quickly became no. So that was the first reason. The second reason we saw was because the central government or the federal government under President Ghani didn't really have any constituency in many of the cities. And it became a question of, well, why am I fighting for this person who probably is corrupt and doesn't really represent my views? And then third and the last reason is we believe that in many cases deals were cut by the provinces themselves to say, look, we're probably going to be overrun. And rather than losing, tens of thousands of people, civilians in many cases, it's probably better for us to give up, agree with the Taliban, and maybe be able to basically leave with our lives in hand. So when you combine those three, we saw this really swift 12-day assault by the Taliban, where they've essentially taken over the whole country except one province, without mass casualties.
Idrees, when you first came on, you mentioned, part of your work is reporting, in terms from the Pentagon. Was there a sense when Trump had first made this declaration and then Biden moving forward, was there just rumblings within the Pentagon of, holy bleep, it's about to happen, we have a lot to get ready for, or we are in no position to think about this? But were there rumblings, obviously not dissension, but just concerns that, in your view, may not have been given as much weight by either administration in the plans to withdraw troops?
Yeah, so I will say, the military has for the past 20 years been overly optimistic about Afghanistan and their capabilities to turn the country and to make it a success. So, we've heard from commander after commander saying, hey, look, if we have 1 more year, 2 more years, we can really turn this around. Obviously, none of that is, turned out to be true. And so there was, coming into President Trump and then President Biden, a lot of fatigue with the military and the views they held, because they had failed on a lot of things in Afghanistan over the past 2 decades. When President Trump made his decision and his announcement that, look, we're going to cut a peace deal, the military was concerned, because for them it meant essentially, having to withdraw troops, and the military never likes giving up troops or bases. But there was some level of hope that, look, we have a year for this to work, and if it doesn't work, we won't leave. So there was a bit of concern, but I think there was some optimism and hope that maybe the withdrawal wouldn't happen if the Taliban didn't live up to the conditions that were set for them, which included, reduction in violence, negotiations. When President Biden made his announcement in April, military recommended that he does not go down to 0 troops. He leaves some level of footprint. So again, it was another instance of a military telling the president, hey, we should leave some troops because we think it could get quite bad. So yeah, I mean, to answer your basic question, was there concern? Yes. Part of it is because the military never likes giving up bases and troops in countries, but part of it was, if this happens in a precipitous manner, which I think we can see now it did, the Taliban could make big gains, and it could lead, in the future, to it becoming another safe haven for extremism. And I think that's the biggest concern right now.
Is this also part of a larger narrative of us, and us as Americans in this case, never truly understanding the territory?
Oh yeah, I absolutely. I think part of the reason is, you have to go back to the 90s, right? The United States was obviously involved when the Soviets were there, and I think the focus then was obviously getting the Soviets out, embarrassing them, and then the region was kind of abandoned by the United States, right, for the better part of a decade and a half until 9/11. And for anyone who kind of understood history or the region, you would know that it's just not a good idea to do that. And then fast forward to 2020, we're at a situation again where the United States never seemed to learn from history, and really they never understood the region. I mean, I remember talking to someone, and then they were mentioning 2001, where the United States was flying spy planes over the country of Afghanistan constantly. They were sucking up all the signals intelligence, but they only had one Dari and one Pashto speaker. So they had all this intelligence, but they didn't have anyone to translate it, and even less people to understand it. And I think that's obviously that was early on, but it really never changed, because in many cases, many of the troops who came to Afghanistan, who rotated in and out, were there for 6 months or 9 months, and that's not enough time to understand a country as complex as Afghanistan. And then you obviously have policymakers in Washington who are, obviously well-educated and, well-read and everything, but have political reasons, and many of their constituents don't understand that this is a very complicated part of the world, it's corrupt, can be corrupt. It just takes time, and I think that's something that no one ever really took the time to understand, unfortunately.
And that's kind of the goal of why we started the show, from an informative and educational standpoint. I want to ask you a present day question, because we're seeing a lot. You wrote about this in your article that we're going to get to a little bit later on, about was it worth it? But the Biden administration has been getting criticized a lot for not only messaging, but not being unified. We've seen Kirby at the Pentagon saying some different things that the president didn't take with him into his presser. And then Jen Psaki's getting asked these different questions from the White House press corps. So what could the Biden administration have done better in terms of being unified in messaging? Because, they announced that they wanted to be out by 9/11. Biden ran on similar to what Trump did in terms of no more new wars and getting out of the region. But it just looks like they botched something here. And now specifically the messaging part of it, they're getting hammered on. So what could the Biden administration have done differently from the messaging standpoint of all being on the same page?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's very tough to message a crisis, and that's what they found themselves in. And it is a pretty bad crisis. I mean, they didn't expect it. No one expected it, to be honest. So, I mean, I'll say that to begin with, it's never easy to message in a crisis. Secondly, a lot of the individuals at the White House currently were in the Obama administration. And the Obama administration was notorious for being a White House that tried to control the messaging over State Department, over the Pentagon, and tried to be unified. And counterintuitively, when you sort of exercise so much control and micromanage, that actually leads to those government agencies not rebelling, but having their own opinions and being frustrated, and actually that ends up leading to more ununified messaging. So this desire to be unified weirdly actually led to a lack of unification. And the third thing I'll say is the White House obviously is basically a political agency, not even agency, right? It's a political part of the government. The Pentagon and State Department, obviously, especially the Pentagon, is supposed to be nonpartisan and just apolitical. And so their job, they see it, is to essentially give facts and figures, whereas the White House, I think, sees their job as running the country, and at times that means being political. And so we run on this essential question of for the Pentagon, either this thing happened or didn't happen. And for the White House, it becomes a question of well, this thing may have happened or may not have happened, but here's what you should be focusing on. And so inherently there's this contradiction and tension. And so we're seeing that basically play out. And I'm trying to think of an example. One example that's come up is President Biden in his speech, not today, but the one that he gave over the weekend, said kind of bizarrely that Al-Qaeda didn't exist in Afghanistan anymore. He kind of stumbled, upon it. No one asked him. He just kind of said it. The White House's reaction was for Jake Sullivan to come out on Monday and say basically, well, what he meant to say was Al-Qaeda no longer presents a threat to the United States, right? So he kind of interpreted Biden's message and try to relay that. The Pentagon, John Kirby, came out very clearly. He said, no, Al-Qaeda exists in Afghanistan. And so he was speaking on facts, whereas the White House was, trying to, I don't want to use the word spin, but basically try to explain something without criticizing the president. And so to your question of what could they do to be more unified, I think, these guys have morning meetings every day. They sync up, they have the talking points. But it comes down to, it's really hard to spin facts when you're at the Pentagon or the State Department. I'll give you another example. Today, or for the past couple of days, there's been a big question of how many American citizens have been evacuated. And over the weekend, we got figures of 2,500 Americans had been evacuated. But clearly the message went out from the White House saying, hey, stop giving out numbers. And so for the past couple of days, we haven't been getting numbers. And Kirby at the Pentagon saying, it's a couple of thousand and I can't give you more details. So that's an example of everyone getting on the same page. With that being said, obviously President Biden has come out and said, the number's 4,000. And so now I think we'll hear more of that, but it's a case of I think stumbling into a situation where they all just have to kind of figure out how to do it. And it's not easy when, facts are all over the place.
I'm glad you mentioned Al Qaeda a moment ago. Idrees, for a literacy moment for a second, when we think obviously the Taliban now is the ruling authority in Afghanistan, but you mentioned the organization of Al Qaeda. For our listeners, as we think of these two different entities, and obviously they're very different, but I go to you to ask, what is the difference between these two organizations?
So it's interesting because, they are dissimilar and similar in the same breath. So obviously this, 9/11 was essentially carried out by Al Qaeda, not by the Taliban. But the Taliban were in the crosshair because they were harboring Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, where essentially the plotting of 9/11 was done. So, they're intertwined in that way because, when the US invaded Afghanistan, they essentially had to kick out the Taliban to get to Al Qaeda. And what we've seen over the past couple of years, and this is, very public according to the UN reports that we've seen over the past couple of years, is both organizations still maintain a level of cooperation, and they have for the past couple of years. And there's a lot of concern about what that will mean going forward for the United States. Those are the similarities. What's dissimilar is kind of what the intention is for each organization. So for the Taliban, it is to essentially run Afghanistan according to Islamic law, right? That they want to be a government, essentially. Al Qaeda is a bit different in that they share some of the same values, but they also want to attack the United States and Western interests around the world. So the main difference is essentially what they want to do. For Al Qaeda, so for the Taliban, it's run Afghanistan. For Al Qaeda, it's attack the United States. And so I think we see those some of the main differences. And again, another difference is just the number of people in Al Qaeda. We're talking maybe low thousands. The Taliban, we're talking 70 to 80,000 people. So it's just intention, size is different, but they do maintain some level of cooperation.
It appears that the Taliban's in the process of, for lack of a better phrase, rebranding itself. There's been reporting now talking about a different treatment of women. In your assessment, from your reporting and everything you're understanding historically, should this attempt at rebranding be trusted with the Taliban back in power? Should we expect a different approach to authority or to governing from this organization in its current iteration?
So I will say what I've been hearing and what I personally believe is I don't think we can judge them until August 31st, when all Western troops are supposed to be out, and I think they will be out, because right now there's a microscope on them. Right, we have television crews, journalists, governments, everyone just laser focused on them. So how they behave in the next week, I don't think is an indication of how they intend to behave the future. So I think that's the first point. Have they changed? That's a good question. Obviously, time will tell. One view is that they haven't, in that this is what we saw when they took over in the 90s, which is, they started off with a softer approach, lighter approach. And then as time went on, the economy suffered. There was civil war. They really clamped down. And so I think, we'll see how they've changed or haven't changed when things get really tough, and they will get tough pretty fast. In another way, I think they have been forced to change by stuff like social media, right? So in the 90s, seeing women not go to school, or beheadings, or just the, very assertive, aggressive, oppressive rule that they had, people saw it and people read it, but it wasn't in your face. With social media, everyone kind of has a phone. And I think when you start seeing those images being broadcast, it's going to have an impact. And at the end of the day, the Taliban do crave international recognition. They need it to be funded and get investments. And so I think this sort of, growth of social media will force the Taliban in some way, even if it's not genuine, to be a bit different from when they were in power in the 90s.
Idrees, one of the things that we're seeing here domestically, and it's playing out on media circles, specifically right-wing media, is now everything that's happening with the Afghan refugees that are coming in. You're hearing a lot of this from the Foxes and Newsmaxes of the world that are making these claims. We shed a little bit of light for our audience about what's being misreported in some of this. What's a piece of information that people are getting wrong about the process of bringing the SIVs over, other refugees, American citizens? Break that down for our audience if you could.
Yeah, so I mean, there are different visa categories people come under, right? And so when we're talking about the evacuation, the administration said the priority is Americans, to get out Americans. And then you have subcategories within Afghans at risk. So the sort of most at risk are called SIV applicants, which is special immigrant visas, which is essentially if you worked for the US government over the past 20 years in Afghanistan. So whether you were an interpreter risking your life, it was primarily interpreters actually. If you were essentially risking your life for the US government in Afghanistan, like interpreters, you fall under this category known as the SIV, and you are a priority for the evacuation. And then a category below that is called P1, P2. So these are, not people who work for the US government, but who worked at human rights organizations or were journalists in Afghanistan, Afghans who were journalists. They come under that P1, P2 category. And so they're, fast tracked essentially, but they're not as high a target for the Taliban essentially. And so that's how the administration has broken down the priority list. Now, what we're seeing is a lot of criticism, or not a lot, but it's bubbling up slowly, mainly from the right wing, about how many Afghans are going to be allowed into the country. Are they going to be vetted? The usual points you would hear from people who are anti-immigrant. A lot of it, obviously, is just plain false because in many cases, the people who are going through the security checks, security screenings are screened far more than any visa applicant coming to the United States from other countries. In many cases, it takes 3 years to 10 years to get this SIV visa application through, which is obviously far more than is actually even legally allowed, but they just go through a rigorous test. And I will say for a lot of these people, they held some of the highest security clearances the US government had when they were working for the US government. So this idea that they would in any way be a threat to the United States, I think is far, far overhyped. And I don't think it fully appreciates the fact that essentially they were working for the US government in very sensitive roles, either with special forces or CIA or, whatever you kind of want to look at. So there's obviously a lot of misunderstanding of that. Numbers kind of vary as well. So, if you talk to a refugee resettlement group, they say 125,000 people is the number that should be evacuated. That number is probably closer to 60,000 that will realistically be potential. And obviously a far lower number will actually be evacuated when all is said and done. And what's happening is a lot of these refugees are going to end up in the United States at military bases around the country. We have 5 bases now around the country, but a lot of them are also going to be resettled in third countries that we've reported. So, Qatar is hosting a bunch of people. We've heard, countries as far as Albania and Kosovo will take in refugees. And so, I know the number sounds pretty surprising, 125,000, but in reality, they're going to be spread out not only across the United States, but across the world, really. And so, many of these people, if not all, are highly educated, highly skilled people who, are in a tough situation, not because of anything they did, just because, the country's collapsed.
And something tells me they're less likely to storm the Capitol building, come January 6th of next year.
Maybe.
There's that. Idrees, in a recent piece you wrote, the question about was it worth it, was explored. In your view, just for our audience, as you reflect on just your reporting research over the past, as we're seeing this relationship with Afghanistan for the past 20 years, starting to come to an end, or at least evolve to a new place. I'll ask you that question you posed. Was it worth it?
Yeah. So I mean, the story I did kind of looked at it from the point of view of a service member, right? Was it worth it? And the honest answer is there probably is no one answer. So if you're someone, so I mean, I'll look at it from different perspectives, right? So if you're a service member who served in Afghanistan and lost a number of friends, which is for many service members, right? And then you look back and say, the country I thought I was helping build up collapsed in 11 days. And, in that process, I lost 3 of my best friends. Realistically, the answer is probably no. And it's an unfortunate answer, but I think realistically, if you look back objectively, it probably was no. But if that, same service member, if you look at another side of the coin, which is, yes, the Taliban has taken over in 11 days, but over the past 20 years, the percentage of women going to school has gone up. I can't even remember, but it's like significantly tenfold, right? We're talking like 50% increase in education of girls. The mortality rate for children has gone way down. The lifespan of women, for example, has gone way up. So there have actually been improvements. And, it almost depends on what side of the coin you look at. So if you're looking at just simply the top line, where's the government, where are the forces? No. But if you kind of dig down on the details, I think you would say yes. But that yes would be with an asterisk because we don't know how it's going to evolve over the next 10 years, right? If all those gains go away, then that too would be a no.
Idrees, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you from that same article, there's been a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking on this. Obviously, everybody on Twitter now is an expert on Afghanistan. And you posed 2 questions kind of in that article. The was it worth it that Nick just asked you about? But the question I wanted to know was what could have been done differently? Because we're seeing a lot of people, and it's playing out on the television media landscape, giving their opinion as to this was rushed, this was hurried, this was this, this was that. But nobody, at least, was really vocalizing how we should have an exit strategy for getting out of there. Because, like I mentioned before you came on, the Trump administration had set a deadline. I believe it was either end of April or May 1st of 2021 to be out. The Biden administration said, no, by 9/11 we'll be out. So everybody knew we were leaving. But I don't hear any solutions as to how this could have gone better for not only the Biden administration, but for the withdrawal of everybody that we have there in the region. So what are you hearing in your reporting of in terms of, well, we missed it on this, we should have done this differently?
So I'll give 2 answers to that. When you say what could have been done differently, the first thing that could have been done differently, which I've heard from so many officials, is the U.S. should have never gone in as a nation builder. It was able to take over Afghanistan very quickly, should have just stopped there, right? So that's like the broader what you've done. The second one is the way the withdrawal was done. So, when you're right, everyone knew the withdrawal was going to happen. And the Pentagon was like kind of frustrated, but they were like, look, we've done this for 20 years. We're not winning. It is time. The problem was the way it was done. So, everyone knew you're like August 31st is the end, right? We knew this for months. And, as the date was approaching a couple of months ago, the Pentagon very quietly told the State Department, the White House, being like, look, we're going to have to evacuate a lot of people, Afghans, and, it's going to be an issue. Give us the authority to start flying out a few of them. Let us open up some bases for them. That way, when we're closer to the deadline, we won't have concerns, mass hysteria at the airport. And the State Department said, let's wait, let us talk to third countries. We don't want people necessarily coming to the United States if we can get other countries to agree to take them. And they kind of slow rolled it. And you ask what could have been done differently. If the State Department and the White House had approved some of the Pentagon plans to evacuate people earlier, I don't think we would be in this condition. Because imagine, in the past 10 days, the US has evacuated 70,000. That'll be going up significantly more. But imagine if that had been done over the course of 2 months. It would have been far more orderly. It wouldn't have required, 6,000 troops to be in Afghanistan right now. And so to your basic question, they could have done the exact same thing just over the course of a longer period of time if they had planned a bit better.
Thank you so much for your insight, Idrees Ali. Thank you for joining the program. Foreign policy correspondent covering the Pentagon for Reuters. Check out all his work at Reuters.com. Follow him on social media. You've been doing a fantastic job. Continued success. Thank you for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.